Yeah, you sound super sexy, in fact.
That's what my wife says.
This episode is sponsored by Front End Masters. They have a terrific lineup of live courses you can attend either online or in person. They also have a terrific backlog of courses you can watch, including JavaScript the Good Parts, Build Web Applications with Node.js, AngularJS in Depth, and Advanced JavaScript. You can go check them out at frontendmasters.com. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary offer of $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they also give you a $1,000 bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the JavaScript Jabber link, you'll get a $2,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at hired.com/JavaScriptJabber. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code JavaScriptJabber, you'll get a $10 credit. Let's face it, bookkeeping is hard, and it's not really what you're good at anyway. Bench.co is the online bookkeeping service that pairs you with a team of dedicated bookkeepers who use simple, elegant software to do your bookkeeping for you. Check it out at bench.co/JavaScriptJabber for 20% off today. They focus on what matters most, and that's why they're there. Once again, that's bench.co/JavaScriptJabber. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 203 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hey, everybody.
Jamison Dance.
Hello, friends.
Dave Smith.
Hi.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick shout out about React Remote Conf coming up in about 2 months. We also have a special guest this week, and that's Rob Eisenberg.
Hey,
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
my name is Rob Eisenberg. I'm a JavaScript client guy. I'm the lead architect for Aurelia. I've also worked on a number of other front-end frameworks, Durandal, Caliburn Micro, Caliburn, on a bunch of different platforms. So that is my passion, and I love working with developers and helping them to build front ends.
Cool. Do you want to tell us, kind of give us the elevator pitch for Aurelia?
Sure. Aurelia is a next-generation JavaScript framework for building, apps across mobile, tablet, desktop, the browser, of course, anywhere where web technology reigns supreme. We're all about simplicity, conventions, really keeping your JavaScript code pure and clean. Aurelia is very focused on standards compliance and just helping you to be real productive and enjoy the developer experience while you're building apps.
Yeah, you said it's a next generation app, and I was thinking the web, the final frontier.
That's right.
These are the voyages of the framework Aurelia.
You gotta have a Star Trek reference.
That's right.
So I feel like we kind of live in a world where there are only 3 frameworks for most people.
Say 2.
And right now that's Angular and React and Ember. How do you, as someone outside of the large 3 that kind of dominate the market share, how do you sell people on Aurelia? Are you trying to take people from these other frameworks where you say, like, these are problems you encounter in other frameworks? Or are you aiming at people that are coming from maybe a jQuery or from non-JavaScript backgrounds?
Well,
what's the selling point for people from these different backgrounds?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything, to be honest. There are a lot of people that haven't really made the leap, so to speak, into building rich JavaScript front-end apps yet. So something like Aurelia makes a lot of sense for them. It's really easy to learn. They don't have any preconceived notions, especially about how these things go together. It actually maps very nicely to a lot of native app development concepts. So they see a lot of things that are familiar to them. So that's one group of people. And again, one of the things that is kind of a selling point, I guess, across all groups is just the simplicity of development with it. I mean, you create a JavaScript class, you create a view, and that's your component. There's no configuration. There's no special APIs to call. It's just a very simple way of putting things together. And of course, we all also try and address a number of issues that, other platforms suffer from. So we do talk about that. We have to be careful about that because people get upset.
Are you attacking people's babies?
When you call the baby ugly, they get a little upset about that. But the truth of the matter is that, as time passes, we learn things as a community. We learn things as individuals. We find ways to do things better, and we need to pay attention to those. And Aurelia tries to kind of take some lessons from a lot of things that have happened in the past and make evolutionary movements forward in terms of fixing different kinds of things and improving different things. So we try and make developer and designer collaboration really easily by just staying close to web standards and having a strict separation between views and view models, which is part of our component design. We try and have a very extensible, very modular system so that there's ways to plug in all over the place and customize things. We try and follow a very declarative model. We try and stay out of your way as a framework so you don't have to learn a ton of APIs just to get things done. So that makes the framework just more learnable and more easy to read, easy to bring new people in. But I think there's a lot of evolutionary things that we're doing that appeal to people coming from that have experience with Ember or Angular or React that look at it and they go, okay, wow, this makes sense. That's really simple. And they can see how they can put these pieces together. Hopefully that answers your question. There's so many different perspectives and people with different backgrounds out there, but I think that there's something of interest, of course, in Aurelia, no matter what perspective you're kind of coming from. So we're trying to talk about a lot of different things.
It seems like a pretty uphill climb in the current climate to sell a new web framework or a new JavaScript client-side MVC.
I think it's been amazingly successful. If you look at some of our statistics, our Gitter chat room has over 3,000 developers in it. That makes it the 7th largest Gitter room in the world. It has about 223,000 messages, which is the 2nd most active Gitter room in the world. We have over 300 contributors to the open source project. That's not including our core team. That's 100 more contributors than Angular 2 has. That's about half of what Ember and React have. And we've only been announced for about 1 year compared to the 3 to 6 years that those other frameworks have had. So you can see that what is happening with Aurelia is actually a rather rapid growth. So yes, it is a challenge, but I think when people are seeing it and they're trying it out and they're kind of catching the vision for what we're building and see the direction where we're going, it's making a lot of sense to them. And a lot of people are getting involved and starting to build things. So I think if you kind of look at the life of the project, like I said, we only announced the alpha in February of last year. And we're still in a beta right now. The amount of growth and traction that has happened in that very short period of time is rather phenomenal, especially when you do compare it to some of these other frameworks that have been around for multiple years or that have big marketing or branding, if you will, powers behind them.
So then I'm curious, what is the draw with Aurelia? I mean, I definitely see the challenges with displacing some incumbents, but at the same time, you're also going to get new people coming in, looking at frameworks and going, this is the one I want to use, or coming over from React or Angular or Ember saying, I like this particular bit of things better than, something else. So what is that selling point? What is that thing that people are coming and seeing and going, yeah, this is the thing I want?
So the first thing people see, and it becomes immediately obvious when you use Aurelia, is the absence of the framework inside of your application code. So with Aurelia, we try and make the framework be kind of more ambient in the sense that it's doing the work for you behind the scenes, but when you're writing your app, you just start plain JavaScript. So Aurelia is really the only framework that I know of today where you literally can build entire applications without importing the library anywhere into your JavaScript code. Now, in reality, you do import our APIs and use them in more complex scenarios. But the point is that the framework really stays out of your way so that you can model your application through just pure JavaScript classes. And you don't see the framework intruding into your code. And that just lets developers focus on their app more. It makes their own code easier to read and understand. Again, it makes it easier to learn things. They don't have to worry about a bunch of APIs. It makes things more extensible. It increases the lifetime of your code, because as frameworks and technologies change over time, the less that the framework intrudes into your app code, it means the longer the life of your app code. It's going to survive changes in other technologies easier. It means that we can rev our framework more, even across major versions, without incurring a lot of upgrade work on the part of developers. Again, because they're not engaging our APIs directly as much as with other frameworks. So I think developers see this and they go, wow, this is about the best it could be, in that sense that I just wrote a plain JavaScript class. I didn't import some Aurelia library. I didn't call some special API. It's just a class with properties and methods. And then there's a HTML view that renders that out. And it's just really simple and clean. And I think that's the first thing that probably catches most people. And they go, oh, this makes sense. And I like this because I really don't want to have to learn a million, Angular API calls to create some directive. I should just be able to create a class and it should just work. And that's kind of what Aurelia does. So that's the first thing I think that catches people. And that's, I think, something that's very unique to Aurelia that I haven't seen really anywhere else.
Could you go a little bit more into detail on how exactly you can use Aurelia without actually directly engaging with the API, to use your terms? Like, what does that look like hands-on?
Yeah, so imagine that you just create a class called app, and it has two properties. I just give it a property message and give it a method called speak or something, and it shows an alert that displays that message. Now, it's just a normal class. You're not importing some Aurelia APIs or anything like that, but it has state, it has properties, it has methods. And then you create a view, which is a web components HTML template, and you create some HTML that's going to render that class. And so the methods and properties of the class are available to you to bind to in the view. So that's the only place that you see, quote, Aurelia APIs, but it's a very simple binding language in the HTML. Your JavaScript remains clean and pure as just a plain class. So that's how you would put together, say, a simple component. Now you can break your app down, of course, into components and components of components and components of components of components, and you can compose them together. Now you can choose how you want to compose them together. You can compose them through JavaScript, through standard object composition techniques, and Aurelia can render that out because it just renders the state of the objects. Or you can compose them through the view as well by using a custom element called compose we have, which you can point at any class and it will render that class using its view. And so you can use these different techniques of composition, but it's actually possible to build whole apps without ever, like I said, without ever using any Aurelia APIs in JavaScript. You can keep your JavaScript really clean and pure. In practice, you usually use some of our APIs for a few things at least, just because it's more practical to architect things in certain ways. But you have a much cleaner JavaScript code base, which is free from intrusion of the library APIs themselves.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying the JavaScript itself won't necessarily inherit from or call into any Aurelia-specific APIs, but the HTML will, right? But it also uses web component language somehow. Can you explain how that works? Like, where does Aurelia start and web components stop, and so on? Yeah.
So when you create an Aurelia component, it has two parts to it. It has the JavaScript part and the HTML part. The HTML part is just an HTML fragment that resides inside of an HTML template, and that's a web component. Part of the web component spec is the HTML template element. So we leverage web component technology for that. What Aurelia does is it understands that components are constructed in a certain way. It knows that every component has this JavaScript class. It knows that it has this corresponding view, and therefore it knows how to instantiate the class. It knows how to, compile or parse the template. It knows how to bind them together and render that. So it does all that work, if you will, behind the scenes. We use various other web components technologies. You can use Shadow DOM if you want. And we have a fallback if the browser doesn't support Shadow DOM. We don't use HTML imports. That's kind of not really happening right now. And we have an option to use web components custom elements if you want. But we use our own kind of custom element code internally because it's way, way, way more efficient for a lot of scenarios. So we use a couple of the web component specs where applicable, and we make other ones optional. But really, again, it's just about trying to make it easy to develop. So developers can really just think about, what is my code? What is the state that's interesting to display here? What is the behavior here? And not having to worry about lots of configuration or metadata or API calls just to set up a component. You don't inherit from anything. You don't have to configure anything. You just create a class, and then you create your view.
So I'm a little curious about the production usage so far of Aurelia. What kind of projects are you seeing people put together in production? And in addition to the projects, what kind of people are you seeing adopting Aurelia for production use? Like big corporation, big enterprise, small or businesses, line of business type stuff, what are you seeing?
Right. So first, let me just preface by saying I can't give any company names because I have to be real careful about that. Various companies' marketing departments don't approve of me using their name in certain contexts. But
if you whisper it in Pig Latin, it's actually okay.
I can tell you that various large companies of which you would recognize the name are using it for a number of things. We're seeing it used across a lot of different companies. It's being used in healthcare. It's being used in insurance. It's being used in manufacturing. It's being used certainly it's being used in line of business. It's being used in the financial industry. We're seeing it used for more design-oriented things also, and media-oriented apps. I'm trying to think, what are some other examples? I mean, it's just about everything, to be honest. Transportation industry, government.
So by no means is it going into a niche in those respects.
No, it's a general
team size or project itself.
It works really well for very large-scale projects. It works really well for small projects. It's great. One of the things that it really is very good at is facilitating team collaboration. In fact, there's a really cool Pluralsight course coming out that one of our core team members did, which is how to use Aurelia to facilitate team productivity. And there are just certain things about the way the framework is put together that it helps a group of people work together really well. So you can have a very large-scale team, have multiple teams working on highly composited apps, or you can have just a single person that they have that they are the owner, developer, marketer of their company, and they're developing their own product. We have the full breadth of scenarios building, and companies building with Aurelia now.
So one of the things that you will sometimes hear different framework apologists talk about is, hey, and this, I think I often see this in blog posts where somebody put a blog post that says, choose between, these 5 frameworks. And then when they get down to it, they try to break it down to, if you're doing this type of application, you should use this framework. If you're doing this type, you should use this framework. I personally have never adopted that sort of attitude. I've never thought that was really a viable way to choose a framework was based on the kind of app. Now, there's certainly some kinds of apps that just don't make sense for certain frameworks.
I don't know, Joe. I mean, if you're building an Angular app, you should probably use Angular.
I can give you an example, though. I mean, some of the things that I've heard are, for example, Ember has some really nice data management bits to it, where you're pulling data off of the server and you're keeping track of all that stuff.
Right.
React manages state flow and data flow really nicely. Ember is usually used to manage transformations on the DOM and things like that really neatly. So, the flip side of this is that the to-do MVC, I've heard proponents of pretty much everything except Backbone say, yeah, well, it doesn't show off the really powerful features of the framework. So, I mean, are there specific aspects of Aurelia that lend themselves really nicely to specific classes of problems?
Sure. One thing that Aurelia does very well is what I would call dynamic composition of user interfaces. So imagine that you're building a dashboard app, and depending on what user is logging in, they're going to have their own custom configuration of widgets that are displayed on their dashboard, which widgets they've selected, how they're configured. And so when you render that screen out, you want to render these widgets based off of the data. And with other frameworks, usually you have to write a lot of imperative code to do that. It's a bit complicated. With Aurelia, it's super simple because we have this notion of UI composition whereby you can basically just repeat over this these list of widget configurations and just render each one. And even if there are different types of objects or different types of widgets, we can kind of polymorphically render them. So for each type of object, we can automatically render a different component and so on and so forth. I once actually built a system. This is actually with Durandal, but this concept comes from Durandal into Aurelia. I once built a system that was a graphical scripting engine, whereby we completely rendered the entire abstract syntax tree of the language as a set of hierarchical components. And it was done with this one simple composition capability. It required exactly 2 lines of HTML to do. And the system was fully extensible so that as I expanded the scripting language over time, I simply created new AST nodes and new views, one for each of them, and it just worked. It was a good architecture that illustrated the use of the open-close principle so that the system could be basically infinitely extended without ever having to change any of the existing code. And that's kind of the thing that you get by using compositional patterns. And Aurelia is very, very, very good at this. So we talk about these components and, I want to have food custom element and bar custom element and this screen and that screen. But the other thing that Aurelia can do is dynamically combine and render any combination of class, view, and model object. And it can combine them in certain ways, and it can do it completely based on data at runtime. And as those values change over the course of the program, it will recompose and re-render only the parts of the screen that change based off of the changing of that data. So if you've got an app that you're building that's very driven structurally and visually by the content of the data itself, then Aurelia makes it very, very easy to build that kind of an app. Like you mentioned, pretty much all the major frameworks, they do most things pretty well. But that's something that Aurelia does exceptionally well, and I haven't really seen anything quite like it among the other major frameworks. You could do that with React pretty easily, I think, just because you would use just traditional JavaScript polymorphism to do that kind of thing, to render your React components that way. I haven't seen what I'm talking about in any of the frameworks like Aurelia that have more declarative data binding systems, like in Ember or in Angular or something like that.
Yeah, it seems like you're saying you can at runtime you can mix and match like what template should be rendered with what like component, and it seems like in Angular, and I don't know about Ember, but that stuff's all defined like more statically.
Yes, and with Aurelia we have conventions because 80% of the time you do it a particular way, but you can override the conventions and you can use these other compositional mechanisms that let you mix and match anything. And again, it can be completely based off of data, and it can change as the data changes over the life of the app. And it's really easy to do that. And I'm very passionate about that feature because I've worked a lot over the years with companies building apps where this particular feature just ended up making something take 5 minutes instead of 5 days or 5 weeks even in some cases. So it's very, very powerful. And that's a kind of a core capability of Aurelia that I think people end up selecting it for, that kind of dynamic UI composition.
Interesting.
So you mentioned Durandal. Is Aurelia Durandal 2, or is it totally different? Or mostly different?
Yeah, Durandal, there is actually a 2.0 of Durandal. So Durandal had 2 major versions, and it's still quite successful today. It's one of those, I think, less known frameworks, but everywhere I go, every city, every country, people are coming up to me telling me about what they've built with it. It's actually a lot behind the scenes in big companies and in governments and in insurance and healthcare and other places. It's not the kind of thing that you would see out in the limelight, but it's used all over the place. And really what happened with Durandal 2 is there came a point where I realized that to really kind of take things to the next level, it needed to be reimagined in terms of, ECMAScript 2015, in terms of web components and some other things like this. And Durandal was really built as a thin layer over Require.js, jQuery, and Knockout. And some of those dependencies were actually causing some limitations on Durandal itself. And so we realized that we needed to remove those third-party dependencies, build a new modern data binding engine, base modularization on ECMAScript 2015 modules, get rid of the jQuery abstraction, which was not necessary in modern browsers. And so, you can think of Aurelia as a reimagining of Durandal. There's a lot of similarities. For anyone that used Durandal in the past, they will recognize that our router is basically configured the same way. Our navigation and routing lifecycle has the same names for all the callbacks. Durandal had this composition capability. Aurelia has it. It's kind of nicer in Aurelia. The methodology for creating components and building apps is the same with Aurelia as it was in Durandal. So there's a lot of similarities so that people that have Durandal code bases can very easily migrate to Aurelia. And we have members of our core team that were highly active Durandal members that actually migrated rather serious apps to Aurelia really early last year with great success. So you can think of it as it's not a Durandal 2.0, it's kind of like a Durandal 5.0. You know, it's a really reimagining and kind of a jumping ahead, but really in the same vein, the same concepts kind of evolved in terms of more modern technology.
While we're on the topic, I would like to hear a little bit about the similarities between Aurelia and Angular 2. I mean, I know from history you spent some time on the Angular 2 team, then you left and you went and started Aurelia. So what similarities does Aurelia and Angular 2? And I actually have a little bit of experience with this. I wrote a blog post about a little simple app to write in Angular 2, and you wrote a derivative blog post on that showing how to build it in Aurelia, showing that, hey, there's actually a ton less ceremony and stuff when you do the same thing in Aurelia. So I'm kind of curious as to what the similarities might be.
Right. Well, the similarities are from an architectural perspective when looking at components. Both frameworks use the same separated presentation pattern. So, you know, things like MVC, MVP, MVVM, all these patterns that are under the umbrella of separated presentation. You know, each framework kind of picks one of those and has their own twist on it. And really, both Angular 2 and Aurelia use something that would be called the view model pattern or the presentation model pattern, or you may have heard the model view model pattern. And this is something that arose really in heavily data binding based platforms. And this pattern is where essentially you have some class or object that models the state and behavior, and where you have a view that renders that state. In effect, the class becomes a model for the view. And so both Aurelia and Angular 2 have that same basic architectural concept when it comes to building components. And incidentally, that's just actually the same design pattern that Durandal uses, and it's the same design pattern that some of my other platforms use going back to about 2005. I first started using that particular presentation pattern on Windows Presentation Foundation, which was a highly declarative data binding based platform that Microsoft released. They released it in 2006. I was an early adopter. And that's kind of when that term view model or model view model started to originate. It was kind of in that community. And of course, it was used in Flash and Flex, and it was used in Silverlight, and then it was started to be used on the web as well. So that's kind of a big similarity in terms of the architectural way that components are put together. Where they differ then is kind of in the details of how you do constructing these view model pairs, if you will. You know, as you mentioned, you had written this post that showed how to do it with Angular 2, and basically what I did is I cut out a whole bunch of code and said this is how you do it with Aurelia, because Aurelia favors convention over configuration. So you would just create a class and create a view in Aurelia, whereas in Angular 2 you would have to have a lot more metadata to describe kind of how those pieces fit together. Other similarities, I mean, they're both component-oriented architectures. That's very common in a lot of the frameworks. React is obviously a component-oriented architecture. Ember is component-oriented. Sort of all the modern frameworks follow that pattern in general. And like I said, depending on each framework kind of has a different presentation pattern maybe that they use to build their components. So those are other big similarities. When I worked on the Angular 2 team, I did the first implementation of their new router. And I know that has changed probably quite a bit since I left the team. But that router actually was based on Durandal's router, believe it or not. And Aurelia's router is based on Durandal's router. So there's interestingly, the routers for both frameworks have a common heritage in Durandal. So there's some similarities there, although there's, again, variations in terms of they've gone kind of a different direction and we've gone kind of a different direction. I think, what are some other similarities? Those are a couple of the big similarities. I mean, obviously with both frameworks, we're really focusing on modern JavaScript, so ECMAScript 2015 and beyond, and or TypeScript. We build our code with Babel, whereas like Angular is actually built with TypeScript. But in both cases, we both support either direction that you want to go in writing your own code. So that's a big similarity. Trying to think, what are some other similarities? I mean, there's a lot of differences, and it's all in the details of things. I personally think that they add up enough that there's compelling reason to choose Aurelia. Obviously, I felt there was enough, or else I wouldn't have built it. But I think that an Angular 2 developer, if they wanted to build something with Aurelia, would be able to learn Aurelia very quickly. Conceptually, they would see a number of similarities. I think they would find it easier, obviously. I think they would probably write less code. I think they'd have a cleaner solution and on, and I could say all kinds of things like that. But I think that they would see some common ground there. But you would also see this, I think, even with Ember. Something like React, of course, is very different. But Ember and Angular and Aurelia have a very similar way of kind of thinking about the problem. And I think that if you're coming from one of those backgrounds, you would see a number of similarities.
I have to ask, you mentioned convention over configuration, and I found that in systems that adopt convention over configuration like Rails and Ember, it's very easy if you're working along the assumptions that they make when they create the conventions. But when you need to go outside of them, sometimes it's fine and it's easy to work outside of the convention, and sometimes the framework kind of gets in the way a little bit. How easy is it to work around the conventions in Aurelia?
It's pretty easy, actually, because the conventions are layered on top of an infrastructure that you can tap directly into. So the conventions are basically just like shortcuts for doing things which you could always do manually. And so at any point in time for anything, you can kind of take control and say, well, I want to do it this other way. As an example, when you build a component in Aurelia, you build this class and say you put it in your app.js module, and then you'll have your view in the app HTML file. And the framework just knows that those two pieces go together, and that's how it works. But you could say, well, for component app, actually, I want to use, Bob HTML as a view. And so you can say, like, well, for this instance, I want to override the convention and specify that the view that renders this component is over here. But it actually goes beyond that, because in Aurelia, we have this notion of view strategy, which is that for every component, there is a strategy that determines how to render that view. So rather than even just pointing it at some other template, you can actually implement this view strategy class, and you can write custom code that can go load the view from anywhere you want, compile the view in any way you want, and it can be all asynchronous and completely deliver this factory, if you will, that creates views for this component on the fly. So there's this layered architecture around components, but at the top, for the 80% use case, you don't see that. It just follows this simple convention. But you can drop down lower and lower and lower to different levels to take more and more control. And like I said, even with Aurelia, down to the point of controlling how and where templates are loaded from on a per component basis, having your own parsing and compilation logic. If you don't want to use HTML, if you want to use something else, or if you want to imperatively construct a view in code entirely and hand it back, you can do anything you want. At that level. But the conventions are all built on top of that. In fact, we have, talking about these view strategies for components, we have something called the conventional view strategy. And that's the implementation of view strategy, which a component gets if the component does not specify a view strategy. So that's the kind of technique that's used throughout Aurelia, whereas it looks for configuration. If it doesn't find it, then it falls back to some convention, which we think is a very reasonable pattern for developing, say, the 80% use case. But you can always override that with anything you want.
That makes sense. Sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, I found, because I do a lot of consulting, that's basically what my job has been for the last 10 years, has been consulting with all sorts of different companies, and it's been primarily in front-end engineering. And the thing is that every company, every product just has something unique about it, and there's something that you didn't plan for explicitly in the way that the conventions work, or explicitly in what's out of the box with the framework. They have to do something unique, usually. And so you want to make sure that they can. You don't ever want to box them in so that they hit some hard barrier that they can't pass through, that they have to then go all the way back to, in worst case, throughout the framework and rebuild things, or go so low level that it's as if the framework isn't giving them any benefits at all. So you have to kind of layer these abstractions very carefully so that developers can take that control when they need to, but also think about, based off of, in this case, it's based off of a wide range of experiences that I have and that our team have had. We kind of can determine, like what's 80% of the time, roughly, what are people going to need to do? And we can make that super, super easy. And that makes things easy to learn again as well. Just less to learn. They just write simple code. And then on an as needed basis, they can kind of decide to override things or drop down and do crazy things if they want.
I wanted to talk a little bit about web components. You've mentioned Aurelia's integration with web components a little bit. And I was just reading through the docs on your site too. Is it required to use web components, or does it just work well if you want to use them with Aurelia?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different kind of ways to look at this. First off, that by default, our templating engine. So remember that. Let me back up. Remember that web components is actually a collection of specifications. So there's typically HTML template element, custom element, shadow DOM, and HTML import. Although HTML import's kind of in parentheses, if you will, because it's extremely contentious right now. So our templating engine by default assumes that you're writing your views using HTML template element. So it just uses that particular specification directly, and that's just how you do things. You can override that and do different things if you want. Most people won't, because there's not really a tremendous need or benefit even from really doing that. So that's one spec that we use directly in the core. You can also specify on a per component basis that you want a component to render into shadow DOM instead of into the light DOM. And so we will use that feature of web components if you tell us to. And we have a fallback for if it's not implemented in the browser. And we also enable all the features of shadow DOM, even if you just want to create a light DOM based component. So we do content projection is kind of the main thing that we enable there.
What's content projection? I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, so for the Angular people out there, it's transclusion basically. But in web component speak, it's content projection. So imagine you have my custom element, and my custom element has is a name tag. Let's just call it name tag custom element. And when it renders itself, it's going to render as, like this section with a header that says, hello, my name is, and then there's going to be at the bottom, there's going to be a footer. And then somewhere in the middle, it wants to render the person's name, right? But that's not part of the component. When you use my name tag custom element, you want to, in the content of the HTML, place the name and then have that projected into that content slot in the web components view. So that's called content projection.
In React, it's this.props.children, right? Effectively the same concept.
That probably sounds like it's right. I'm not a React expert, so I couldn't tell you for sure. I know that in Angular speak, it's transclusion.
Yeah.
In web component speak, it's called content projection. So we support all that, even if you're not using shadow DOM. So, we enable you to optionally use it natively if it's present. But even if it's not present, we enable it, and we kind of model our component design off of shadow DOM so that when you're working with our components, you don't have to think about whether it's there or not. And you're learning these web component specifications while you're learning Aurelia. And that's one of the interesting things we've heard the community remark is actually a positive aspect of Aurelia, which is they felt like the hardest part of learning Aurelia is that they had to get up to speed on ECMAScript 2015 and web components. But that's actually a great thing for them long term to learn the real kind of native languages of the web. And we really encourage that. Those are kind of two of the specs that we use internally. We let you optionally use HTML imports. So our template loading is done completely through the ES6 module loader, but we let you plug into that to control how templates are loaded. So if you want to integrate with something like Polymer, we have a lot of people that are, well, not a lot of people, we have a chunk of people that are using Polymer and Aurelia together. You can tell our templating engine to use web component HTML import technology to load its templates. And that works really nicely when integrating with Polymer. So that's an optional plugin. And then for custom elements, we work with any web component. So you can bring in third-party web components and things just work. And there's some configurations you can do to set up things. If a particular element isn't quite working the way you want, you can tell the framework a bit more about it and make it work. But we also support the notion of exporting Aurelia's custom elements as web component custom elements. And that's an optional plugin you can drop in for, say, somebody that wants to basically do the same thing as what Polymer does. Like they want to build web components and maybe create this web component library for other people to use, but they want to have a framework to help them do it. So they can drop this plugin in and it will export Aurelia's custom elements as web component spec elements, which can then be used inside of any other framework. So you could then take Aurelia, for example, and use it inside of a Polymer app, or you could, assuming Angular 2 is supporting web components, you could use an Aurelia web component inside of an Angular 2 app. So there's a lot of different angles that we kind of try and integrate and work with web components by specifically using the specs, by modeling things after the specs and enabling optional usage, by integrating with some of the specs to facilitate working with other frameworks, and by having these optional plugins that allow us to export components to these standards as well. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, that does. I feel like that's one of the better stories of web components that I've heard from a technology perspective. I feel like oftentimes it's just this magic word. It's like the big data of the front end. You just say web components and then it must be good. But that makes sense. That it sounds like it makes the framework better to use the underlying technologies.
We're trying. I'm really big on standards. My personal experience working with native technologies in the past, I've been burned a number of times. So I've just become, by virtue of that, I think I've just really had my eyes open to the goodness of the open web and really trying to play well with specifications and with the broader community and building frameworks and libraries and tools that facilitate and help other developers to kind of work that way. So that's really important to us.
Now, I asked this question when you were on Adventures in Angular, or at least a version of this, but I'd like to talk about it again. We're seeing a large movement, I think, in the MVC frameworks that are going on today towards this concept of one-way data flows and single-state trees. Can you talk about that in respect with Aurelia and maybe your opinions and thoughts about it?
Yeah, in short, I think one-directional data flow is awesome. I think that's a good characteristic to have of a system. I don't know that it's something that you can always have 100% of the time for every app you build, especially very complicated apps. But I think it's a good quality, and I think it's something to aim for. To that end, Aurelia's data binding system by default is one-directional, meaning that data flows from your view model, your JavaScript state, into your view and not the other direction, with the exception of form elements, which usually you need to synchronize with. So those flow in two directions. That's actually part of the convention. So talking about how conventions work in different ways in Aurelia, data binding in Aurelia has this notion of conventions, which is that data binding is always one way except form elements, which are two way. That's something you can actually override on a case-by-case basis, making any binding one way, two way, or one time. And you can actually plug in additional behaviors and do all kinds of crazy interesting things. So Aurelia supports this notion of unidirectional data flow by making its default convention for all normal bindings basically to be one directional. But it also supports developers practically knowing that there are cases, particularly in the local collaboration inside of a component, where two-way data binding that's isolated makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of things simpler. But it discourages developers from doing the sort of things that were problematic with data binding systems historically, both in Angular and Ember, which I think that those teams that, the Angular and the Ember team would both agree with me and would want people to stay away from these types of things. And the types of things people used to do were basically using the binding system as a messaging system, which it should not be used as. So there's a way.
Can you go into more detail about that? That's a really interesting thing that you said, and it's one of those concepts I'd like to.
Yeah. So
can it be explained?
Yeah, a binding system, under the covers is working basically on some sort of eventing, kind of quasi-eventing system, right? When this thing changed, notify this other thing, and then it does something. Now that's shockingly like a pub sub model, right? Or an event aggregator, or these kinds of patterns. But it's not traceable and it's not visible the way an explicit publish subscribe architecture would be. You take something like Flux. from the React world, and this is a very explicit architecture around actions and messaging and the way that works, and people can see it and understand how the flow of things works and how the application is supposed to work. Now, if you you can actually accomplish the same thing through data binding by simply binding properties to properties. Then when that property changes, it triggers something else and changes some other property. And so it's possible technically to achieve the same thing, but it's a disaster architecturally because the visibility of what is happening in the system is completely hidden. There's no way to trace that. There's no way a developer looking at a particular component can see what is actually happening there. They can't see the side effects of things. So when you use data binding, it's not bad inherently in itself, but it can be abused in that sort of way that causes tremendous problems. And of course, that causes a lot of issues with Angular 1 because when it was used that way, the digest cycle had to keep running over and over and over again. And then that resulted in performance issues as well. But you want to use a data binding system in a very local way. That is to say, within a component, the view and the view model are connected, and that is the only state synchronization that's happening. You're not binding to binding to binding to binding to binding to pass some messages, some weird location way up the tree that nobody could ever discern from looking at your code. If you really have something that is messaging oriented, you want to use a publish subscribe architecture of some sort, event aggregator or something like Flux, if that makes sense for you. But you don't want to try to achieve those same types of things through a binding system. It's just disastrous. And depending on what framework you're doing it with, it could be disastrous in multiple ways. So really, it's about picking the right tool, the right approach for the problem at hand, and not trying to solve messaging issues with data binding. So yeah, those things are good for certain contexts, and you want to kind of be careful about how you're using them. I've seen some crazy
great
things.
explanation.
I've seen some really, really crazy things over the years. So you have to be careful about that. Data binding, I'm a huge fan of data binding. Obviously, it's in Aurelia, and I've been doing it for over 10 years now across different platforms. So I find it indispensable for productivity and just eliminating boilerplate. But you have to use it within the set of constraints that it was designed for. If you try and use it for these other things, you're just asking to have a disaster. Use an event aggregator or some sort of publish subscribe architecture for those other things. Absolutely.
I know you had a couple other questions, Dave. I want to make sure you got a chance to ask them.
Yeah, should we talk about routing? Can you tell us what Aurelia does for that?
Yeah, so Aurelia has a router plugin. So Aurelia actually is very componentized. Even its core is a set of small modules that kind of come together. And the router is an additional plugin you can drop in. It's one that most people use, but you don't have to use it. And it's a typical router at the surface level. It tracks the history changes, and basically it maps those patterns to modules, ECMAScript 2015 modules, and which basically equate to components in Aurelia, right? So what happens is if you match the customer route, then you can say that maps to the customer module, and we'll use the ES6 module loader to grab the customer module, and that exports a class. It can be just a plain class, and that's the behavior and the state for your screen. And so then we'll load that. We'll load its view by convention usually, and we'll render them, and we'll display that in the screen. One cool, there's a lot of cool things about Aurelia's router. We have hierarchical routers, so if that component that you just navigated to, it can have its own router internally, which routes relative to the parent, and it will then render components internally inside of it. So you can have these hierarchies of routers if you want, which is really very useful when you have large-scale applications where you have teams that are working on different parts of an application together, but where they want to stay out of each other's turf, if you will. So they want to have their own router that they configure. And so you can let, say, a whole team, you can just say, here's your router, configure it, build this whole section of the app as if it's living in isolation. Because in the end, it's actually just a component, but it's a very rich component that maybe has sub-routers and sub-screens and things. And then you can drop it into the larger app, and it will just plug in to that root app-level router. So we have these optional hierarchies of routers. We have very explicit state transitions. The router internally has an asynchronous pipeline, very much like what you might find in server-side routing. And you can plug steps into it and remove steps from it. And that it just controls how the state transitions from screen to screen. And you can cancel navigation, and you can asynchronously load data during navigation and do all kinds of interesting stuff. It's quite powerful, pretty easy to configure. And it follows the same sorts of conventions that the rest of Aurelia does. So, in Aurelia, whether you're creating an app or a component or a screen that's going to be navigated to, or a modal dialog box or a pop-up or any of these kind of things, it's just a component. It's just a plain class and a view. And the router works with those same primitives.
Does that transition stuff allow you to hook in for animations and things like that as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So Aurelia, the templating engine, has an animation abstraction. And anytime it modifies the structure of the DOM, we have this internal abstraction called a view slot that represents some location in the DOM where things are going to be added or removed or inserted and so on and so forth. And so the router, when it loads up a component, it just talks to this view slot and says, all right, add this component into this location. And the view slot automatically talks to our animator and gives the animator the opportunity to animate this adding or removing or inserting of the component. By default, there's no animation, but you can plug in different animation libraries that implement our animator interface, and it will just work with everything that manipulates DOM structure. So we have a CSS animator out of the box. That's an optional plugin. We also have a velocity-based animator that you can drop in. You don't change any of your code anywhere. You just install the plugin and configure the animation. And it works. It works with routing. It works with composition. It works with repeaters that add and remove things from items. The same abstraction is used everywhere. So you can do animation that way.
That's cool. I'm really glad to hear that the animation stuff is built into the framework. That it seems like that's a thing that a lot of frameworks just didn't think about, and then it's a hard problem to solve after the fact.
It is. It's that's kind of from some learning with Durandal. With Durandal, we kind of hacked it on a little bit later, and it proved to never be quite ideal. So with Aurelia, we wanted this abstraction to be a core abstraction in the templating engine in the core. But we wanted to give flexibility to people because there are some amazing animation libraries. Like, we didn't want to be responsible for having to build the most cutting-edge, amazing animation library out there. We wanted somebody that loved using GreenSock or Velocity or Tiny Animate to just be able to drop it in and have it work seamlessly with our templating engine. So we had that notion of that animator abstraction as something kind of we learned the lesson from in the past, and we really wanted it in there from the beginning with Aurelia.
Outside of routing, does Aurelia have support for animation?
Yeah. So that animator plugs into this view slot abstraction, and anytime anything gets added to the DOM, it gets added to a view slot. So the repeater, for example, when you repeat over an array and it renders a view for each item in the array, it's pushing items into the view slot. If you have an if binding that conditionally renders or doesn't render something, when it does render it into the DOM, it's pushing it into a view slot. When you display a modal dialog, it's pushing that into a view slot. When you compose the application root, it's pushing it into a view slot. So anywhere in the app where there are structural changes that are made to the DOM by any component, that goes through a view slot, and the view slot talks to the animator. So any of those things can be animated.
I have some housekeeping questions, like really basic things that maybe have quick answers, but I think are interesting to people nonetheless. Can you tell us a little bit about code size? It sounds like it's plug-in architecture, so it's not like a kitchen sink all in one, but tell us how much code we'll have to add to our users' download to use Aurelia.
Yeah, so this is actually a really fun question because we just had a release today where we knocked about 50 or 60K off of the library size.
Nice.
So the core of Aurelia now, I think, is sitting at about 200 and, like I said, this just changed today, and I haven't gone and bundled and minified everything to get the exact number for the final count as of today's release. I mean, literally like a couple hours ago. I think it's sitting about 220K minified for the core. And you can add another 40K to that, which will include a CSS animation, an HTTP client, and the router. That's roughly the same size as Polymer, although it's got more features than Polymer, because Polymer out of the box doesn't come with the router or animation or HTTP. That makes it about 150 to 200K smaller than Ember, and it's about a third the size of Angular 2. Angular 2 is quite large. So in terms of modern frameworks, the only thing smaller than it is React. And of course, React's more of a rendering library and less of an all-in-one framework, if you will. Angular 1 is also smaller, but I'm kind of, no offense to anybody, I'm kind of thinking of Angular 1 as a kind of a previous generation framework. So it's among the smallest of the modern full frameworks. It's highly modular. So there's a lot of things you can pull out and change or add things on depending on what you want to do. So we really embraced ECMAScript 2015 modules and thought very carefully about the architecture of the framework as a whole, so that we could have these discrete pieces that could evolve independently of the other pieces and be maintained by different developers and just independently versioned and released, and yet collaborate together as part of a larger framework, if you will, that people could use as a one-stop shop if they want for building apps.
Cool. My second nuts and bolts question is, what are your minimum supported browser versions, especially Internet Explorer?
IE9, yeah. Usually when people ask versions, they only care about IE9.
Yeah, so true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we support IE9 and above.
And what's the minimum version of Opera Mini? I'm just kidding.
Actually, we were recently, just this week, doing some work on Opera. So we didn't officially support it, but we're working on that.
There's one Opera Mini engineer listening with a single tear just running down his cheek. Like, my operating my browser's a joke.
We had a request from somebody that used the Pale Moon browser. Which I had never heard of.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, so he said, I found a bug.
Yeah.
Pale Moon browser. I said, we'll look into it.
Oh, man. I recently learned about... Oh, go ahead.
As you say, obviously we want to support as much as we can. But
I recently found out our app at work has some bugs with AOL browser, which apparently is a thing. There's been several incarnations of it.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's a thing. People still use that.
Maybe it's hipsters using vintage browsers to get back to the roots of the web. Yeah. I still use Mosaic. Because that's how it was supposed to be done.
That's how our overlords at the University of Illinois wanted it to be.
Yeah.
My last question for you is about performance. Like, what kind of work have you put into it, and how does it stack up? And I know this is not like an easy question to answer in one sentence, but tell us a little bit about performance culture, let's say, on the Aurelia team.
You're supposed to say, Dave, it's fast.
It is. It's awesome.
It's faster than your framework.
It is. No, we actually... I come from... I kind of have this belief of not needing to do the optimization work too early. So in the beginning of Aurelia, we focused a lot on getting the right abstractions in place, getting the right developer experience, all those kinds of things. Along the ways, making lots of notes about, okay, this is some place we can do performance work. Here's a place we can do performance work. About November of last year is when we actually started the very serious performance work. And believe it or not, within about 6 weeks, maybe less, we had tuned performance to the degree that if you look at the DB Monster demo, for example, this is one of these classic list rendering demos that was put forth to show React performance. We're rendering about twice as fast as React. It renders in that demo at roughly the same speed. It depends on what browser, of course, and everything else, but I've seen it 10 to 15% faster than Angular 2. I've seen other people say that Angular 2 is faster. Again, it really depends, but they're basically right there, neck and neck, for the DB Monster benchmark. That's just an independent benchmark on performance. So basically, Aurelia is right there at the top in terms of performance. Then you've got render time. That's something we're constantly working on. It's probably down to a couple of 100 milliseconds now to render, where most of our initial render time issues have come from technologies not ours. Actually, we found this insane bug in Edge's promise implementation that if you replaced Edge's promise with Bluebird, like it would go from taking 20 seconds to load down to taking 200 milliseconds. We have actually discovered a number of performance issues in other technology, which we've gone back to those projects and alerted them and tried to contribute. Like the Edge team, to their credit, is, of course, in development right now fixing that issue. So it's a very serious known issue with their Promise implementation. It's actually a regression from Internet Explorer, believe it or not, a massive regression. So we're constantly doing work on, time to initial render. And that's really improved quite a lot there as well. So performance-wise, I think we're right there at the top with the best of the best there.
And what kind of tools do you give developers who are building apps in Aurelia to diagnose and improve the performance of their own apps?
Yeah, so we have our own benchmarking tool, which is open source. It's the stuff that we use to benchmark all of the framework itself. And so that's actually completely open source. It's actually written with Aurelia. It gives graphs of different performance runs over time, both visually and metric numbers and, different things like that. So we make that available to anyone that wants to use that tool and write their own benchmarks to test things out. We have some Chrome debug tools, but those are not really performance oriented. They're more, like I said, just debug oriented, inspecting the state of things like that. And we're constantly brainstorming about improving tooling. I think that's something that we hope to do a lot of work on in the next year, really building up some rich tooling around Aurelia. But you can use the same benchmarking stuff that we use. It's just under the Aurelia org on GitHub. It's the benchmark repo. So you can totally pull that down and write your own stuff and test your own app.
One other thing that I wanted to ask, it actually came out of a question that Dave posted in the chat. You mentioned that you can write Aurelia in ES6 or ES 2015, and you can also write it in TypeScript. Can you write it in ES5?
You can, actually. We have, if you go to... Actually, we don't show how to do that in the documentation now that I think about it, but you can. We basically, you would write classes in ES5 the way you would have written them in ES5, prototype-based, constructor function-y stuff. And that really just interprets that the same way. And if you want to use decorators, which we use for some things, we have an API that lets you use them in ES5 that doesn't require any special syntax. So we've tried to think very carefully about making sure kind of our optimal experience is really, ES next, basically, is what I would call it. But we've thought very carefully through all the APIs to make sure that there are decent ways to do them with ECMAScript 5, though we really strongly encourage people to adopt modern JavaScript. But it is absolutely accounted for.
One last question that I have is, I looked at Aurelia a bit, and I don't remember seeing anything in the way of data management. So reaching out to the server, you get JSON back. I know that Ember does some inflation into actual JavaScript objects that do stuff, but Angular doesn't really do that. A lot of these other frameworks don't really do that. Does Aurelia provide something like that, or do you expect other people to provide that layer?
For the moment, we basically only provide an HTTP client. And we have tried to help people basically to use some of the other libraries that are out there that are good at this sort of thing, and shown them how to get a really nice experience using them with Aurelia. One that's really popular is Breeze.js, and one of our core contributors has used that a whole lot. And he's got some really cool demos out there using a Breeze with a traditional Northwind database and Materialized CSS, where he builds the whole line of business app, and shows how to use it. So we basically, right now, what we want to do is have a really strong front-end framework, but we want to enable people to bring to the table the libraries that they like best for certain things, like what's your favorite validation library, what's your favorite data library, what's your favorite animation library. Bring those to the table, and we've designed Aurelia to integrate really well with all these things. So we're not trying to tackle that data problem right now. It's a big problem to solve on its own. And we feel that there's been some good work out there already, and we're kind of trying to point people to that and show them how to use that.
All right. Well, I think you ran us all out of questions.
Awesome. Now the only thing that's left is for all of you to build Aurelia apps. And then send them to me.
All right. Well, let's get to the picks while we're waiting on that. Joe, do you have some picks for us?
Sure, I do. So my first pick is going to be crispy bacon. In between asking questions, I was eating a whole batch of crispy bacon, and it was delicious.
Oh, man.
Does that mean that your second pick is greasy keyboard?
It's crispy, Chuck, so it's not greasy. That's the point.
What are the units on a batch? Is a batch like a kilo or
slices?
I measure it in micrograms. It's several billion micrograms.
Several. Okay.
Yes.
Inches added to the waist.
You need to go out right now and eat a batch of crispy bacon. Now, you may or may not understand what a batch is. That's up to you to figure it out. But nonetheless, a batch of crispy bacon is the assignment here.
A batch is what you feel in your heart.
Right.
Now, dear listener, you have two homeworks. You have to write an Aurelia app, and you have to get some crispy bacon.
Crispy bacon, right.
Or best together.
Secondary, if it's not a batch, it can be a plethora. Either one is acceptable. My second pick is going to be a musical that I saw about a year ago, and I'm going to be seeing it tomorrow night. It's called A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder. One of the funniest musicals I've seen. I saw it in Broadway, and it's traveling here in Utah this time. I'm really excited to go see it. Absolutely hilarious. Highly recommend it if you happen to like plays or musicals. It was a great one. And my final pick is going to be my favorite pick by far, and that is Jamison Dance's React conference talk. It was absolutely amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it, and I was a little bit proud to be from Utah watching Jamison just kill it on stage over at React Conf. He talked about Elm and the justification for why you should learn Elm and the things that are great about Elm, and I think he did an amazing job. And in my opinion, the best half-hour talk you can see on Elm that is available yet as of this date. So go watch it. There'll be a link in the show notes, or you can go to just React Conf site and find Jamison and watch his talk. It was absolutely great.
Do you hear this? That's the sound of me blushing, Joe. Thank you.
All right, Jamison, the Elm expert, what are your picks?
Please never call me that again. I don't want people to get a false impression of how smart I am. My picks are two picks. They're both albums that I found this week. One is called Vessel by Lorn. Lorn is one of my favorite electronic bands, and they put out a new album on Bandcamp a couple months ago that I just found out about yesterday. So it's really good, kind of mellow dubstep-ish, but not dubstep music. And the next pick is an album called The Moon Rang Like a Bell by 100 Waters. And it's very different from Lorn, but it's also good. Those are my two picks. That's what I've been listening to this week.
All right. I've got a couple of picks here. The first one is I just barely put up. If you go to javascriptjabber.com, you can get the top 10 episodes of the JavaScript Jabber Show. Just put your email address in the form that pops up, and you'll get them in your inbox over a couple of weeks. And I'm super excited to have that up. Hopefully it helps some people. If you haven't been listening for long, or you're just kind of getting started, or if you want to kind of see what was popular with folks who were listening to the show, you can go do that. My other pick is Amazon Prime. It's just a super convenient way to get stuff shipped here, and I really like it. Finally, the last pick, this is the one I was trying to remember. My wife bought me a Wii U, and it's way fun. It has Mario Kart 8 on it, which is also way fun. She got me a few other games. I haven't played them yet, so I'll probably pick them later. But yeah, Wii U is really awesome. Rob, what are your picks?
First pick is going to be a program called Sketch, which is a digital design package. It's actually gotten a lot of traction recently. It's especially good for doing web design and app design. It's probably one of the biggest things to start encroaching on Illustrator's territory in the last year or so. And a lot of UI, UX guys really like using it, and it's a cool tool. Second pick is in a similar vein, and it's an app called Zeppelin. And Zeppelin is this online tool that's all about designer and developer collaboration. So how do you build these amazing application experiences? How do you get developers and designers to work together? And Zeppelin is a pretty cool service software option for that. And then my third pick is going to be Mozilla's Servo. I heard you guys say you had a show related to Rust recently. So if you haven't checked out Servo, it's really cool. It's basically a parallel browser engine that's written in Rust. And it also has an experimental web renderer that renders everything in hardware on the graphics card. And I saw some amazing demos of performance from this thing. There was a Rust meetup, I think, where they demoed some of it, and they were showing basically saying literally every website on the net, they could render upwards of at least several hundred frames a second with this render. And there was literally nothing that really bogged it down that was happening today. Looking at performance of graphics performance near or better than native apps. So really exciting stuff, written in Rust, and just continues to help me stay excited about web technology and where that's going in the future. So definitely check that out.
All right. And if people want to go check out Aurelia or find out more about what you're working on, what do they do?
Aurelia.io is where our project's at. You can also stay up to date on news related to the project at blog.durandal.io. And I'm on Twitter at Eisenberg Effect. Those are probably the best places.
All right. Well, thank you for coming, Rob. We'll go ahead and wrap up the show, and we'll catch y'all next week. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more. Do you wish you could be part of the discussion on JavaScript Jabber? Do you have a burning question for one of our guests? Now you can join the action at our membership forum. You can sign up at javascriptjabber.com/jabber, and there you can join discussions with regular panelists and our guests.